Zoro vs. Lucci is a fight that, in my opinion, messes with a lot of recent One Piece scaling, leading people to either glaze the fuck out of Lucci or just downplay Zoro. But if you ask me, this fight just isn't as close as you may think. In this video, I'll be breaking this fight down panel by panel to show you guys just how things actually went down. And if you want to see more One Piece content from myself, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave ideas for future content down below. When we first see this fight, it's on chapter 1091, and what we actually see is at the start of the fight, Zoro is using two of his three swords that are coated in armament hockey, and he swings them at base Lucci, who blocks this attack. And then from there, the force of this attack causes damage to their surroundings and ends up destroying the building they're in, as we see here as they were sent flying. We then don't see the two until chapter 1093, and this is the panel where I think people make such a debate out of this fight. And what we see is Zoro and Lucci have been fighting for a point of time, and they now seem to be tired to an extent, although it doesn't have to be too crazy. It's just Zoro using power that he only now is just starting to get used to, as he only awakened Aycock in the previous arc. But we do see this on panel, and most importantly, Zoro has all three of his swords that are coated in the green flames and Aycock. But in terms of how things actually went down, I think that Zoro is on the offensive and Lucci is the one on the defensive, and Lucci's being pushed back by Zoro. Despite Lucci being pressed, he is able to keep up with Zoro in speed to some extent, and even if you want to say it's only a low-end level of relativity, that's fine, as it is just enough to prevent him from getting cut. This dialogue from Zoro on the next page is probably the most important piece of dialogue from this whole fight and is necessary to read to understand how this fight went. Zoro says, "If this is the best you can do, I wouldn't expect to get a shot at fighting our captain." Zoro is literally telling this guy that if this is the best that he can do, then he obviously has no chance of getting a rematch against the rank above, which is Luffy. Although Lucci responds saying whatever it is he says on the page, I think that Zoro's statement is more important over how he just is not that impressed with Lucci's strength at this point in time, as he came into this fight with the knowledge clearly that this guy had fought Luffy, and it seems that he definitely expected more out of Lucci just over the idea that he fought Luffy after what he had just done in Wano, but now that he is fighting him for himself and he can now see the power difference between him and Luffy, and that even though this guy fought Luffy, it doesn't really mean shit if he's fighting like this and just got his ass beat. And this then clearly leads Zoro to think that the level of power that Zoro is using, that being the three sword style coated in Aycock, it's just an unnecessary amount of power to use against someone like Lucci. And why, you may ask? Well, we next only get a small panel of this fight in chapter 1094, and you actually don't even see them fighting, but what we see is when everyone reacts to Saturn arriving at Egghead, we see Zoro and Lucci's reaction to this, and we see that Zoro has stopped using three sword style in this fight with Lucci. And when you talk about Zoro not using his third sword, a lot of people mix things up with at the end of their fight and say how Lucci probably knocked the sword out of his mouth, and then say that it's not that Zoro didn't want to use his third sword, it's that he couldn't because of Lucci's efforts. But no, he stopped using it right after he made that statement in the previous chapter, where he clearly just doesn't need to use as much effort to take him out. We then see them fight again in chapter 1107, and this really supports what I'm saying even more, where Lucci and Zoro clash out. Zoro now is trying to take him down with two swords, as we know, and is only coating these swords in just armament hockey, so he's not even using Aycock anymore. And now Lucci starts to actually do better against him now, as now Zoro actually acknowledges Lucci as he can hang tough with him. So we see Zoro go from fighting Lucci with all three of his swords that are coated in Aycock and thinks that Lucci just isn't that impressive based on his performance in the fight. He then takes the third sword out of his mouth and fights him with only two, coating them now in only armament hockey, and now Zoro thinks that Lucci can give him a tough fight. So what I said before is just being supported by these statements as the fight progresses. Also in this panel, Lucci actually blocked or caught the blade in his hand, depending on how you see this, which is a feat a lot more impressive than earlier, where he is being pushed back and not really trying to go about Zoro's attacks in this way. On this same panel as well, Zoro also says how how he now wants to put this fight to an end, and I think that this is where people start to think that this fight is closer to than what it actually is. They say something like, since Zoro says he wants to hurry this up, he must be going all out. And we know that this just isn't true based on what we see on panel. If Zoro was truly being pressed and going all out, we would have seen attacks like Ashura, Dragon Damnation, or even, since he's just using base armament, we would have seen like Black Rope Dragon Twister. And Ashura and Dragon Damnation are both attacks which have been stated to be Zoro's strongest attacks, which were used in the past when Zoro was truly being pushed to his limit. I just think the way to think about this is, if someone really wants to bring up what Zoro says, it just doesn't really matter, as making a statement like that when he isn't using those attacks, and even the attack that he comes to use to win this fight isn't a King of Hell style attack like what he used against King. And if that still is just not enough for you, you also have to remember who Zoro was trained by and who aims to surpass, and that is Mihawk. And I'm mentioning this because back in the East Blue, when Zoro and Mihawk first met, Mihawk purposely used the tiniest blade he had on Zoro and says how he does not hunt down rabbits with a cannon, saying how he doesn't kill people so much weaker than him with a weapon so strong when it's clearly unnecessary. This is why he uses this knife on Zoro, which to a prideful swordsman like Zoro is a complete sign of disrespect to his own strength, rather than if he instead had just used Yoru. But he didn't, because someone like Zoro was just so weak that using a sword as strong as Yoru was just overkill. And that could be said about Zoro when he's up against Lucci. Zoro has been fighting Lucci for this point in time, and clearly had used observation haki during their fight to get a gauge on him, and didn't feel the need to use all three of his swords. You can get into other things like it's because of the plot that this fight went the duration that it did, but I just think this inverse answer is sufficient enough. And then in chapter 1110, the point I have been making is brought to full circle, as at any point during the fight, Zoro can just use his third sword and coat all three of them in ACOG and just take out Lucci, which is exactly what he does. He dodges Lucci's hand pistol spots, and then, although he lost one of his swords, he just blitzed him. Lucci now is on the offensive trying to attack Zoro, which he couldn't do before when he was using ACOG, and now Zoro just takes out his third sword and uses ACOG and puts Lucci down.